Johann Hari, warmly welcome to the podcast. What an honor.
Oh, I'm so happy to be with you. Thanks so much. I apologize in advance to you and your listeners and viewers because I'm a little bit, I've just come back from Norway, literally just come back. So I'm like a little bit brain dead. And I had a traumatic experience related to Norway. Can I just confess this, right? Which really haunts
Please.
me. So a previous book of mine called Chasing the Scream that was about addiction and the war on drugs got really championed by an amazing group of people in Norway who are drug formers led by my friend Stjålet Hartsgaard. And so I came to Norway lots of times. They invited me to talk about the book. And the last time I was there before this time, I went out on the final night. I went out for a drink with everyone who went out for a meal with everyone who had invited me. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to say something difficult. I'm going to be really honest. I said, you know, it's very difficult for British people when we come to Norway because everyone is so good looking that you're just constantly distracted all the time. But I said, is that just a thing where, like, when you go to a different country, people feel attractive? I said, when you come to Britain, do you find us attractive? Every single person looked down and was completely silent for 30 seconds. And then one of them just said, no, we find you disgusting. So now whenever I go to Norway, I feel like a kind of troll. I'm just So yeah, it's very fortunate. So, but nonetheless, it was very nice. I was in
This is
Bergen.
hilarious. You know, Bergen, and that is, of course, you cannot judge Norwegians by what you do get to hear in Bergen because there are different species. And they always tell you the truth. They're like brutally honest. So yes, yeah. So
I was in Bergen just now. Actually, I think the train journey from Oslo to Bergen is like literally the best train journey in the world. It's so amazing, and
it is amazing.
I just
and it's so.
Yeah.
Sorry, you first.
No, as you can say that I just you can check. I don't say this with every country I speak to. I love Norway. It's just an absolutely Noam Chomsky called Norway the most civilized country in the world, and I agree with him. I think it's unbelievably lovely.
So now, actually, you're speaking to a Norwegian who is of German Korean descent.
Ah, interesting.
So it's so funny because I definitely identify as Norwegian, but then people like when they meet me, they're like, "But you don't look very blonde or blue-eyed." So I agree with you with all the good-looking Norwegians because there are many of them. And then, you know, there are what Norwegians really like is when people do what you exactly right now did when you like stroke our egos. We love to hear that we're generous, good-looking, peaceful, you know, freedom, you know, everything that you connect with Norway. But if you stay here a little too long the next time, Johan, you will find that there is a lot of stuff going on here that might not be as attractive.
Well, I think usually it's a dark side of a place that is attractive. Like I've been reading Knut Hamsun, who was obviously both a brilliant writer and an unbelievably evil man,
yes.
like a really terrible person. So no, I think that there's a huge amount to admire about Norway, and there's obviously, like in every country, like a dark side and a weird side, and I think the weird side is really interesting as well, actually. So it's yeah, but I think you're right.
So I would love for us to dive into Chasing the Scream as well, because that is so closely connected to what this podcast and what my work is about. Really, like spis deg fri, it means eat yourself free from food addiction. So that like addiction, like the big body of work you've done on addiction is so closely connected to everything that we talk about in our communities. And the funny thing is, I re-listened to your TED talk, which I don't know how many million views it has. Like everything you know about addiction is wrong. That has millions and millions of views. I recommend everyone who's listening to go and look it up as a TED talk on YouTube. And I noticed that I've been quoting you, Johan, for many years without knowing that it was you I was quoting.
Oh.
Like what you say there, like the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, or the it is connection. And just to give us a little bit of your background, tell us a little bit, because you're a writer, of course, but you also have a personal history that you take with you into your work. Would you like sharing a little bit of your background?
Sure. There was So I grew up in a family. There was a lot of addiction and craziness. And one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was too young then to understand why. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction in my family, and we still do. And I think, like a lot of people in that position, I was a big mixture of feelings. As I got older, I was drawn to people with addiction problems, and obviously loved the people I knew who had addiction problems. I think I was also very angry with some of my relatives, and I had those kind of what I now think of as kind of drug war voices in my head, like, why don't you just stop? Why doesn't someone just stop you? And they were never the predominant voices in my mind, but they were part of the mix, right? And so as I got older, obviously it was a subject I thought about a lot. And when I started working on Chasing the Scream, which unbelievably to me is 13 years ago now, I for that book I went on a really, all of my books are an attempt for me to solve a mystery, right? There's something I don't understand and I want to figure out. So with Chasing the Scream, obviously I have some ideas in my head at the start. I'm not a complete blank slate, but for me, I think of myself as like, Poirot or Miss Marple trying to solve the mystery, right?
I love it.
It's up to you whether I'm Poirot or Miss Marple. And so for this, I remember when I started writing the book, I had these questions that I just wrote out. One of which was, well, what causes addiction and what can we do to solve it? And there were other things I was looking at about the war on drugs as well. And by the way, Scandinavia, talk about the dark side. I mean, Sweden has a monstrous war on drugs, some of the worst drug outcomes in Europe. We think of Sweden, in many ways, rightly, as this kind of paradigm of social democracy, but has just, I mean, I was really shocked when I went to report on it, the World Federation Against Drugs conference in Stockholm, which is this kind of anti-drug war, kind of pro-drug war thing that happens every few years. And the Russian drugs minister, Viktor Ivanov, one of the most evil men I've ever met. You can imagine how horrific Russia's drugs policy is. Literally standing arm in arm with Sweden's drugs policy. I was completely shocked. But anyway, so I went on this big journey all over the world, and I got to meet a crazy mixture of people and become friends with a crazy mixture of people, from a transgender crack dealer in Brooklyn, who's one of the wisest people I've ever met, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel who'd beheaded 70 people. He's not the wisest person I've ever met. To the only country that's decriminalized all drugs, Portugal, with incredible results. And I learned a huge amount, but I guess most relevant to your podcast is I learned that I'd profoundly misunderstood addiction, and indeed what I thought I had seen right in front of me. If you'd asked me at the start, let's talk about heroin addiction, because that was close to me, right? If you'd said to me, well, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were an idiot, and I would have said, well, obviously heroin causes heroin addiction. Been told this story for 100 years. That's become totally part of our common sense. It was certainly part of mine. We think if you stop, you're in Oslo, aren't you? Yeah. We think if you stopped the next 20 people to walk past your home in Oslo and you kidnapped them, and like a villain in a horror movie, you injected them with heroin 3 times a day for a month, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to crave and eventually would become dependent on. And that's what addiction is, right? The tremendous physical hunger for the chemical hooks in the drug. That's why in English, another word for being addicted is being hooked, right? The first thing that alerted me to the truth about this, which is that chemical hooks are real, but they're actually a very small part of what's going on in addiction. There's some of it, but a very small part. First thing that alerted me to that is something wrong with that story that we've got in our heads, is when it was explained to me here in Britain. If I step out of this interview now and I step into the street and I get hit by a truck and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's medically pure heroin. It's much better than any of the shit I could score on the streets around the corner from here, right? It's medically pure. If what we think about addiction is right, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals who are often given, you know, heroin for quite long periods of time? Anyone watching, if you have a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother's taken a lot of heroin, right? What should be happening to these people when they leave hospital? They should be trying to score on the streets. This has been studied very carefully. It never happens. Medical exposure in British hospitals does not lead to addiction. And when I first learned that, I remember thinking, well, that just can't be true. How can that be true? How could you have a situation where you have someone in a hospital bed who's given a lot of medically pure, strong, potent heroin, they don't become addicted, and you've got another person in the alleyway outside shooting up actually a weaker form of the drug, and they do become addicted? How can that be?
Yes.
And I only really began to understand it until when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an extraordinary man named Professor Bruce Alexander. You should have him on your podcast if you want an intro to him. Let me know. He's one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. And
I would love that. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Just nudge me after this interview. And Professor Alexander did an experiment in the 1970s that has sort of belatedly transformed how we think about addiction and really led to changes all over the world. So in the 70s, Professor Alexander, well, I'll say it differently. When I went to interview him, he explained to me that this story we have about addiction, that is caused primarily or entirely by the chemical hooks, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Everyone listening could try them at home if you're feeling a little bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drug water and almost always kill itself within a couple of weeks by overdosing. So there you go. That's our story. The rat is exposed to the drug. As it's exposed, it wants more and more of it until eventually it overdoses. That's totally our story about addiction. But in the 70s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. They put the rat alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing that makes life worth living for rats. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls. Anything a rat wants in life is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. And this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water. They hardly ever use it. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. So you go from very heavy compulsive use and overdose when they don't have the things that make life worth living, to no compulsive use and overdose when they do have the things that make life worth living. Now, for me, there's lots of human examples of this, and obviously I go through a lot in the book, but to me, this leads to the insight that you mentioned that's obviously kind of had a bit of a viral life, which is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, valuable though that is to some people. The opposite of addiction is connection. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. Once you know that, you can see why what we do, what Scandinavian countries do in particular, is such a bad idea, because that's based on the idea that addicted people are just indulging themselves. We need to punish them in order to give them an incentive to stop. But once you realize that pain is the driver of addiction, suddenly you see, oh, you're actually making the problem worse when you punish people.
And it's the same about like our topic around food addiction, which is not even yet in Norway accepted as an addiction yet. But that is they will get around to us later. But that's okay. But also, like, it's a morally shameful. You should just eat a little less, be a little less greedy, move a little bit, exercise more. So just please behave. So as if it is an individual, morally wrong person that is fat or overweight or obese, which has nothing to do with obesity when you look at it in an addiction perspective, because it's the exact same drivers that you were just mentioning, right? Isolated, feeling lonely. So what if we expose them to a community where they can feel cherished, listened to, loved for who they are, they actually lose the weight. It's like exactly what you just said.
It's so important that as a culture, there are many great things about kind of Western culture, but one of the big problems we have, you see it in the most extreme form in the United States, but increasingly in Europe. I still count Britain as part of Europe, even though my country went mad. What we do is we and this is true of, if you think about the subjects of all three of my books, addiction, depression, and attention problems. What we do is we take problems which are largely, not entirely, but largely systemic, big, caused by big changes. And then we blame the result of that huge systemic change solely on the individual. And we act like the solution has to be located solely at the level of the individual.
Yes.
Now, there are, of course, things individuals can do, and I'm in favor of individual action. But we also need to solve the problems systemically and collectively. We need to predominantly solve them systemically and collectively. You see that most with the subject of my most recent book, Stjålet, Focus, where there has been, there you go. I like the Norwegian cover. How do you say the title in Norwegian?
So the title in Norwegian would be Stjålet, Fokus, which is exactly like word for word. That's funny listening to an American or a British trying to pronounce it based on the letters. They even have a letter that you don't know, the O, but stolen focus. Let's go with the English one. Firstly, I would just have to tell you, thank you so much for writing this book, because I can tell this as a writer myself, this is hard work. This requires a lot of, personal sacrifice in order to produce this 350 pages of insanely well documented material. So thank you on behalf of so many of us who needed this book. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm too British to accept compliments. If you ever look at if you look at pictures of the Queen, videos of the Queen, the late Queen, and not that I'm comparing myself to the Queen here, but whenever anyone would compliment her, she would just have a completely blank face and go, yes. So that's how British people are meant to respond to compliments. So I will respond by going, yes.
Yeah, I love it. I'm just going to throw some more compliments at you. So I will just share with you, because I actually started this book many, many years ago. It's called Mobile Free. That was the title of my book. I have a document on my Google Doc sitting somewhere. I've gone back to it, started it, let it go, started it, let it go. I was not able to do this book because I was not able to cure my own addiction. And then I didn't feel worthy enough to write anything meaningful about it. And then when you came with your book that was just published in Norway this year, I was like, thank God someone else wrote it. Thank you for doing the work, seriously, because this... tell me, like you mentioned somewhere in the book that you started it in 2018, and I know that it was published in the UK last year. So 4 years, more or less, from when you started it until it was published. Could you please tell me, why did you decide to write the whole book on attention problems?
I noticed that my inability to pay attention was just getting worse and worse. It felt like with each year that passed, things that require deep focus that are so important to me, reading books, having proper long conversations, even watching films, were just getting harder and harder. And I noticed that this seemed to be happening to lots of people all around me, and I began to look at the evidence, and it's kind of shocking. The average office worker now focuses on any one task for less than 3 minutes. And for every one child who was identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. But I've been thinking of writing about it for years. And like you, I had a few aborted starts because I was like, well, the reason why I can't focus is obvious. There's 2 reasons, maybe 3. I'm lacking in willpower. I'm not strong enough. Someone invented the smartphone and that screwed me over. And I'm getting older. Right? Those were basically the 3 stories I had in my head. I later realized these were wrong, right? Or hugely oversimplified. But there was a moment. So thought about writing it. Then I would get depressed and get kind of self-loathing. And there was a moment I realized I had to write it. So I've got a godson, and when he was 9, he developed a brief but very intense obsession with Elvis Presley, and it was unbelievably cute because he seemed to genuinely not know that impersonating Elvis had become a kind of cheesy cliche. So he was, I think he was the last person in the history of the world to do a totally sincere version of Jailhouse Rock. And one day, I was tucking him into bed, and every night when I would tuck him into bed, he would get me to tell him the story of Elvis's life over and over again. Obviously, I skipped over the bit at the end where he died on the toilet. And one day, I mentioned Graceland, where Elvis lived, and people go and visit it. And his whole face lit up, and he said, "Johann, will you take me to Graceland one day?" And I said, "Sure," the way you do with, 9-year-olds, knowing next week he'll want to go to Legoland or something. And he looked at me very intensely. He said, "No, Johann, do you swear one day you will take me to Graceland?" And I said, "I absolutely promise." And I didn't think of that moment again for 10 years until so many things had gone wrong. So when he was 15, he dropped out of school. And by the time he was 19, this will sound like an exaggeration. I promise you it isn't. He spent literally almost all his waking hours looking between his iPad, his iPhone, his laptop. His life was just this blur of WhatsApp, YouTube, porn. And it was like he was kind of moving at the speed of Snapchat or TikTok, where nothing still or serious could touch him. And one day we were sitting just on my sofa behind where my laptop is, where I'm talking to you now. And all day I was trying to get a conversation going with him, and I just couldn't. He was just staring at his devices. And to be totally honest with you, I wasn't much better. I was looking at my own devices. And I suddenly remember...
Can I just the thought that came into my mind, that's how I talk with my kids as well, right? That they are doing something meaningless while I am doing something, in quotation marks here, meaningful, right? I'm working, I'm doing something, I'm contributing, I'm writing, but they are just wasting their life on Snapchat. Is that what your thoughts were, like looking at him, looking at yourself?
I know exactly the thing you're describing. I think it was worse than that. I think I knew I was wasting my own time. I don't think I was even deluding myself that I was doing something useful. I think I was watching him waste his life, and I thought, fuck, I'm doing exactly the same thing.
Right.
Which is partly why, maybe why, in that moment, I suddenly remembered this moment when he was a little boy. And I said to him, "Hey, let's go to Graceland. This is no way to live. Let's break this numbing routine. Let's get out of here, right? Let's go on a road trip all over the South." But I suddenly thought ahead, and I said, "If we go, you've got to promise me one thing, which is that you'll leave your phone in the hotel during the day, because there's no point in us going if we're just going to be looking at your phone the whole time." And he took some time, and he really thought about it, because he wasn't happy with the way he was living. And he said, "You know what? I want to do it. Let's do it. I promise I'll leave my phone in the hotel. Let's do it." And I think it was 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more after that we took off. We went to New Orleans first. And then 2 weeks after that, we got to the gates of Graceland. And when you get to the gates of Graceland now, this was even before COVID, there's no one to show you around. What happens is they hand you an iPad, and you put in earbuds, and the iPad shows you around. It says, go left, go right. Every room you go in, there's an image of that room on the screen in front of you, and it tells you a story about that room in your ears. So what happens, it's this slightly weird effect, is everyone walks around Graceland just staring at their screen. I'm walking around getting a bit kind of tense, because it's like, oh, we did travel a long way. Why is no one looking at the place? And we got to the jungle room that was Elvis's favorite room in Graceland. It's got loads of fake plants in it. And I'll never forget them. There was a middle-aged Canadian couple next to us. And the man turned to his wife and said, "Honey, this is amazing. Look, if you swipe left, you can see the jungle room to the left. And if you swipe right, you can see the jungle room to the right." And I laughed out loud because I thought they were kidding. And I just watched them, and they were swiping back and forward. And I leaned over and I said, "But hey, sir, there's an old-fashioned form of swiping you could do. It's called turning your head, because you realize that we're in the jungle room. You don't have to look at it on the internet. It's literally all around you." And they looked at me like I was deranged and walked out the room. And I turned to my godson to laugh about it. And he was standing in the corner staring at Snapchat, because from the moment we landed, He
Yeah.
absolutely could not stop. And I went up to him and I did that thing that's never a good idea with teenagers. I tried to grab the phone out of his hands and I said to him, look, I know you're afraid of missing out, but this is guaranteeing that you'll miss out. You're not showing up at your own life. You're not present at the events of your own existence. This is no way to live. And he stormed off, understandably. And I walked around Memphis on my own that day. And I found him that night in the Heartbreak Hotel where we were staying up the street. And he was sitting by the huge guitar show swimming pool looking at Snapchat. And I went up to him and I apologized for getting so angry. And he didn't look up from Snapchat, but he said, I know something's really wrong and I don't know what it is.
Oh.
And that's when I kind of realized, you know, we came away to get away from this problem of distraction, but there was nowhere to escape to because it's everywhere. It's the air we all breathe now. And that's when I thought, oh, I need to investigate this.
And again, you tell this story in the book, and just the colors and the details you put into it, it's just like heartbreaking, because especially I think me as a teenage mother myself, it's like, oh yeah, Heartbreak Hotel, that's an interesting choice of hotel, right? Because it feels heartbreaking to stand there watching another addict, if we may say so. As an addict myself, watching another addict, and I cannot help myself and I cannot help them. So
I think also the reason it's, as you say that, I was thinking, one of the reasons it's so painful, and it's sometimes easier to see in other people than in yourself, when you see a young person who can't focus, is, I would say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is. That thing that you're proud of required a huge amount of sustained focus and attention. And when your ability to focus and pay attention breaks down, your ability to solve your goals is your ability to achieve your goals is diminished. Your ability to solve your problems is hugely diminished. You feel less competent because you actually are less competent, right? Attention is your superpower. All human achievement requires the ability to pay attention. So when you see a young person who can't pay attention, you know that they're not going to achieve what they would have achieved in their life. They're going to struggle to achieve their goals and solve their problems. It's why it's so heartbreaking. When you feel it happening to yourself, you know that you're not going to be as good as you could be, which is why it's so important to learn about why this happened to us and crucially, how we get our attention back. For me, the mystery is never just about, well, what's the problem here? I'm a solutions-oriented person, right? For me, it was, how do we solve this?
And we are going to get to the solution. I will just throw in, like, I've been taking notes from morning to evening the last few days while reading the book. It's so, like, I will just throw in some numbers here. Okay. The numbers you're referring to are taken from US. In the US, an average person touches her or his mobile phone 2,617 times a day.
It's actually worse now. That was the pre-COVID figure. Amazingly, it's more than that. It's got worse.
And then you have spoken with so many amazing, scientists, including this Danish Sune Lehmann. And I love the fact that he really touches upon what you also, write in lengths about, like, what makes us happy is actually doing something that is a little bit difficult. And then another thing here, Google, Facebook, Twitter, all of that. It's like, I know info has been shared about how these multi-billion companies operate, but the people you have gotten the trust to talk to, like they wanted to talk to, the knowledge they share is just horrific. How these big, huge multinational companies think and use us as their lab and consumer lab, more or less. So, you're right. You Google controls the mind of 1 billion people, like, a quarter of the population, or like a quarter of the grown-up population in the world.
I mean, yeah, that's quite, I wouldn't say they control our minds. It's a quote from someone else, but yeah, I think you've alluded to although it gets at an important truth, yeah, I think to understand these facts, it helps to understand the way I learn this. So um when I came back from Graceland, I decided I've got to try to figure out what's going on here. So I did lots of things, but the main part of what I did is I went on this big journey all over the world, from Moscow to Miami to Melbourne, actually to Oslo. And I interviewed over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus in the world, different aspects of it. And what I learned is there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been hugely rising in recent years. And these factors range very widely. There's some aspects of our tech that are doing it to us, not all. But actually, there's lots of things I'd never even thought about. The way we eat, something very close to the heart of your podcast, is profoundly affecting our ability to focus and pay attention. Air pollution is affecting our ability to focus and pay attention. The way we work, the way our kids' schools work. There's a very broad array of these 12 factors that are doing this to us. But crucially, once we understand these 12 factors, we can begin to solve the problem to some degree at an individual level and to some degree at a collective and social level. But you can't solve any problem if you don't understand what's going on, right? If you don't understand why it's happening, it's very hard to solve the problem. So I'll give you an example of, if it's okay, one of those 12 causes that I think everyone listening and watching it'll be playing out to some degree in your life today, different degrees for different people, but I'd be amazed if there's anyone listening where this isn't relevant. I went to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, an amazing man named Professor Earl Miller. And he said to me, look, there's one thing you need to understand about the human brain more than anything else. You can only consciously think about one or two things at a time. That's it. This is a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The human brain has not changed significantly in 40,000 years. It's not going to change on any time scale any of us are going to see. But what's happened is we've fallen for a kind of mass delusion. The average teenager now believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time, and the rest of us are not far behind them. So what happens is scientists like Professor Miller and scientists all over the world, including in Norway, get people into labs and they get them to think they're doing more than one thing at a time, and they monitor them. And what they discover is always the same. You're not doing more than one thing at a time. What you're doing is you're juggling very quickly between tasks. You're like, what did you just ask me? What is this message on WhatsApp? What does it say on the TV over there? What is this text message? Sorry, what did you just ask me again? So we're constantly juggling. And it turns out that juggling comes with a really big cost. The technical term for it is the switch cost effect. When you try and do more than one thing at a time, it turns out you do all the things you're trying to do much less competently. You make more mistakes, you remember less of what you do, you're much less creative. And I remember when I first heard that from Professor Miller, and I was obviously reading in a lot of detail the studies, thinking, okay, I get it. But this is a small effect, right? This isn't a big thing. And then when you look at the evidence, it's shocking how big it is. I'll give you an example of a small study that's backed by a wider body of evidence. The printer company, Hewlett-Packard, got a scientist in to study their workers. This is a small study, but it's backed by wider evidence. And he split the workers into 2 groups. And the first group was told, get on with your task, whatever it is, and you're not going to be interrupted. And the second group was told, get on with your task, whatever you got to do. But at the same time, you've got to answer a heavy load of email and phone calls. So pretty much how most of us live. And at the end of it, the scientist, Dr. Glenn Wilson, tested the IQ of both groups. The group that had not been interrupted scored, on average, 10 IQ points higher than the group that had. To give you a sense of how big an effect that is, if you or me sat down together now and we smoked a fat spliff and we got stoned on cannabis, our IQs would go down in the short term by 5 points. So being chronically interrupted in the short term is twice as bad for your intelligence as getting stoned. You'd be better off sitting at your desk, doing one thing at a time and smoking a spliff than you would sitting at your desk, not smoking a spliff. You see the point I'm making, right? Now, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. You'd be better off neither getting stoned nor being interrupted, just so no one gets the wrong impression there. But you can see this, and lots of evidence, is why Professor Miller says we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of being constantly interrupted.
So Yeah, the multitasking illusion, like you also so brilliantly explained. But what made me a little bit like I could physically feel my body like sinking together like a depressed potato as I was reading, because, like you mentioned, there's so many factors I have no influence over. Like, even our schooling system. And I really love the fact that you dig deep into how kids are not allowed anymore to play, how important that is to develop our skill sets. And then you know, did I do something wrong when my kids turned 6 and I didn't put them into an alternative schools in the woods? Like, have I, as a parent, also lured these kids into? Do you know what I mean? Like a system that is rigged to really not. Then it's not for their own best.
I mean, I think I would say lots of things in response to that. So that everyone, particularly in a democracy like Norway, has power at two levels, right? We have power as individuals, and there are things we can change in our own lives. And then we have power as citizens to change the bigger things in our society. Now, you can't do that as one person, but you can band together with other people and do that, right? So for all of the 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus that are harming our attention, there are kind of two levels at which we can deal with it. I think of them as defense and offense, right? So there are loads of things that you can do just as an isolated individual to protect yourself and your children. I'll give you an example. I go through loads in the book, as you know, but I'll give you an example of one. I can show you. This is I know some people are listening.
There
So
it is. Yeah, the K thing that you wrote about. Yeah.
have you seen one before?
I've never seen one. I was very curious. Okay, now I'm looking at the plastic box with the blue lid. It's see-through, and there is a digital thing on top of it where you can do something. Okay.
You take off the lid. You put in your phone. I need my phone immediately after this interview, so I won't do it now, but I'll put in this empty can of Coke Zero. You put on the lid. You turn that dial at the top, push the button, and it'll lock your phone away. So I'll lock it away for 5 minutes. Hang on. Oops.
So you swirl that little thing on top so that it sets the time like a timer.
Exactly. You push the button.
Hermetically sealed.
It is now. Nothing I can do to get it out. I mean, I could smash it if there was an emergency, but so then it locks your phone away for however long you tell it to, any time between 5 minutes and a whole day. I use it 3 hours a day to do my writing. I won't sit down and watch a film with my partner unless we both imprison our phones in the phone gel. I won't have my friends round for dinner unless everyone agrees to put their phone in the phone gel. And, at first it's really difficult, but I explain to people the pleasures of knowing that we're all going to be paying attention to each other are so much greater than the pleasures of whatever shitty little notification you're going to get from Instagram. And it's really hard for people to do at first. And then about 15 minutes in, they start to feel the pleasure of knowing that people are actually listening to them, right? And that they are actually listening to other people. And, there was a really interesting study by a guy called Professor Michael Posner, who's at the University of Oregon, who discovered if you're interrupted by something as simple as a text message, it takes you on average 23 minutes to get back to the level of focus you had before you were interrupted. So you think, oh, I'll just glance at my text during this dinner. It takes 10 seconds. It's not a problem. But it takes you 10 seconds plus the 23 minutes it takes to refocus your mind properly.
Yep.
And most of us never get 23 minutes without being interrupted. So there are loads of things like the case safe that I go through in the book that I really recommend everyone does literally today. But I want to be really honest with people, because I don't think most people who communicate about attention to the public are leveling with people. I am passionately in favor of these individual changes. They will make a real difference to your life. They will not totally solve the problem, because at the moment, it's like someone is pouring itching powder over us all day and then leaning forward and going, hey, buddy, you should learn how to meditate. Then you wouldn't itch all the time. And you want to go, fuck you. I'll learn to meditate. That's really valuable. But you need to stop pouring this powder that makes me itch all over me all day, right? We need to, in addition to defending ourselves, we need to go on offense against the forces that are doing this to us. Because one thing we need to understand is this didn't happen because you had bad habits or I had bad habits or there was something wrong with your child. This happened because of these huge invasive forces that are in many cases designed to harm our attention. And that sounds a bit, I would have thought that sounded conspiratorial and weird. Before I did this research, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley interviewing the people who designed the stuff that
Yes.
your kids are using today, right? And one thing they kept explaining to me, I'll give you an example. I mean, it was fascinating how guilty they feel. I'll give you an example. There's a guy called Dr. James Williams, a wonderful man, who worked at the heart of Google. And one day he was speaking to a tech conference where the audience are literally the people who design the stuff you and your kids use, right? And he said to them, if there's anyone here who wants to live in the world that we're creating, please put up your hand. And nobody put up their hand.
Yes.
Right? So even the people designing this stuff
Yes.
are sick at what they're doing. And it's worth explaining why they're doing it then. So anyone listening, please don't right now. But if you opened right now, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, any of them, they begin to make money out of you immediately in two ways. The first way is really obvious. You see advertising. Okay, everyone knows how that works. The second way is much more important. Everything you do on this app is scanned and sorted by the artificial intelligence algorithms to figure out who you are and what you like. So let's say that you've ever indicated, including in your so-called private messages, that you like, I don't know, let's say you've said you like Donald Trump, Bette Midler, and you told your mother you just bought some nappies. Okay, it's going to figure out if you like Donald Trump, you're almost certainly right-wing. If you like Bette Midler and you're a man, you're almost certainly gay. No disrespect to any heterosexual men who like Bette Midler. I don't really believe you. And you just bought some nappies. Okay, you've got a baby, right? If you've been on these apps for any amount of time, they know tens of thousands of things like this about you. And they're learning that partly to sell the information about you to advertisers, right? You're not their customer. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, they've got a customer service department. You can't phone it. The advertisers can phone it. You're not the customer. You're the product they sell to the real customer, the advertiser. So partly it's to help advertisers target you, but also, and more importantly, it's to learn what will keep you scrolling. Because every time you pick up the phone and start to scroll, they begin to make money because you see ads. And every time you close the app, that revenue stream disappears. Every time your kid opens the app and starts to scroll, they begin to make money. And every time your kid closes the app, oh, you see it just opened. Have you heard that noise? That was the K-Safe opening. And every time your kid closes the app, that revenue stream disappears. So all of this AI, all of these algorithms, all of this genius in Silicon Valley is designed to figure out what can we feed you that will keep you scrolling. And they are unbelievably good at it, right? Now, as my friend Tristan Harris, who also worked at the heart of Google, said to me, you can try having self-control, but every time you do, there are 10,000 engineers on the other side of the screen figuring out how to undermine your self-control.
Yeah.
Which tells us we need to stop blaming ourselves and our kids and start blaming the people who are doing this to us. And we can take them on. And I know that sounds fancy, but there's an example that you'll remember, I remember, of when parents and adults did exactly that and massively improved people's attention. So when we were kids, the only kind of petrol you could get in Norway and Britain was leaded petrol, right?
Yep.
And then a group of ordinary mothers in Norway, in Britain, all over the world, what used to be at the time were called housewives, banded together and said, well, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing the lead industry to fuck up our kids' brains, right? And it's important to notice what they didn't say. They didn't say, so let's ban petrol and get rid of cars, right? That would be ridiculous. Just like none of us are saying, let's abolish technology. Let's all join the Amish, right? No disrespect to the Amish. Any Amish who are listening, you are cheating. No, what they said is let's ban the bit that's screwing us up and move to a different option that will actually not do that. And these mothers, they fought like hell, right, for their kids. And because it was discovered that exposure to lead is really bad for people's brains and particularly bad for children's ability to focus and pay attention, right? So we knew that lead was really, really bad for people. And they carried on pumping. And obviously, if it's in petrol, it's in the air, everyone was breathing it in. And then these mothers began their fight, and it followed the classic pattern of all successful political struggles as described by Mahatma Gandhi. First, they ignored them, then they laughed at them, then they fought them, then they won. As everyone listening knows, there's no more leaded petrol in Norway. or in Britain,
Yes.
or in almost any country in the world. As a result, the Centre for Disease Control has calculated that the average child is 3 to 5 IQ points higher than they would have been had we not banned leaded petrol, right? An incredible achievement. Now, that to me, those mothers are a great example of what we need to do now. In addition to protecting ourselves as much as we can with all the techniques I write about in Stjålet Focus, we need to change our environment collectively to get some of the things that are trashing our attention out of the atmosphere, out of our environment. And we can do that. We can regulate big tech. We can regulate the food industry. We can change the way our schools work. We can change the way our offices work. I went to places that have begun to do this, from France to New Zealand. These are not science fiction creations. They're real countries, although France can seem pretty weird at times. They're real. We can do it. But we need to stop blaming ourselves and stop thinking there's something wrong with us and start getting angry with the forces that are doing this to us.
So now, do you think that this needs to come from the consumer level, or do you really do you still believe that governments can force these, like, for example, ban what is translated as surveillance capitalism in I don't know what the word you use in English, but like part of this, to actually install laws that will regulate these global monsters? Do you believe that the government bodies are strong enough to do that?
Oh, governments are much stronger than these companies. Look at Australia, right? So 3 years ago, the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who I do not like, very different politics to me, did a good thing and deserves some credit. So this is happening in Norway, it's happening everywhere. The social media companies are bankrupting newspapers and other media organizations, because it used to be that you would place an ad in, the local newspaper. Now you place that ad on Facebook. So people get their news from Facebook, but the news organizations get almost no money and Facebook takes the money from the ads, right? And it was bankrupting the media, and you need an independent media is essential for a democracy. So Scott Morrison, to his credit, said to Facebook, look, people are getting their news on Facebook. You need to give some of your profit to the news organizations that gather that news, right? And Facebook went crazy. They shit the bed. They said, we're going to cut Australia off from Facebook. They cut off key functions. They went mad. And the Australian government held its nerve, and quietly Facebook gave in, because we are so much more powerful than them, right? They are dependent on us. So absolutely, we can take them on. We can regulate them. We can force them to, instead of the technology being designed to hack and invade our attention, we can regulate it so it's designed to actually help and heal our attention. And there are all sorts of collective actions we can take. I'll give you an example of one that's already been implemented. In France in 2018, they had a huge crisis of what they called le burnout, which I don't think I need to translate. And loads of French workers were just getting terribly burned out, and they wanted to understand why. So the French government, under pressure from labor unions, it would never have happened if French workers didn't organize, as we're seeing in the news at the moment, didn't organize and really fight for their rights. The government set up an inquiry to figure out, well, why is everyone so burned out all the time? And the inquiry discovered a key factor. 40% of French workers felt they could never stop checking their phone or email the whole time they were awake, because their boss could message them any time of the day or night, and if they didn't answer, they'd be in trouble. Right? Now, this is an incredibly recent change. Do you remember when you were a child, did your parents ever get phoned at home by their boss when they finish work?
My father was the boss, so he would never call anyone.
Okay, so with my parents, I literally it never happened, right? I don't remember any of my friends' parents getting phoned at home. Like, it was unbelievable. The only people who were on call when I was a child were the prime minister and doctors, and even doctors weren't on call all the time, right? So we went from almost nobody having to be checking their messages all the time to, almost half the economy having to check it all the time, right? And of course that burns people out. And I can give these people all the lovely self-help advice in the world that I have in my book about K-safes and all the dozens of other things. They can't do it, right? If your job depends on you not doing it, it's useless, that advice to you. which is why they had to have a different solution. And the French government, again under pressure from labor unions, introduced a pretty good solution. It's very simple. Every French worker was given something called the right to disconnect by law. And the law says every French worker has to have their work hours written down clearly in their contract. And when your work hours are over, unless they're paying you extra, you don't have to look at your phone or check your email. Yep. So when I was in Paris, Rent-A-Kill, the pest control company, was fined 70,000 euros because they told off one of their workers for not checking his email an hour after he finished work. Now, you can see how that's obviously frees people up to then make all sorts of changes in their lives, but that's not something you can do as an individual, right? I mean, maybe there's someone very powerful in their workplace listening who can say, you know what, guys, from now on, I'm not looking at my email after 5 p.m. But I doubt there's 1 in 1,000 people listening who can do that. That's not something you can do as an individual, but that is something we can do as a group, right? We can demand that together as a society. And it's one of many collective changes that we can demand. So we are much stronger when we stand together.
I love that. And also, before we wrap up, because I know that you have a busy life and you have your 3 hours to focus today, so I won't keep you. I won't steal your focus. But we just have to dig into Johann, your own personal actions. So you have like a 6-point plan that you follow. And one of the most amazing things you write about in this book is how you actually actively log off. You mentioned how you store away your phone today for 3 hours every day, but you actually log off you're offline 6 months a year. Half the year.
What I do is I get my friend Lizzie, I get her to change my passwords so that I can't get in. Because I can think so much more clearly. When I'm not, because you can say to yourself, oh, I'll just look at Twitter and Instagram for 10 minutes a day. But the truth is, even if you only look at it for 10 minutes a day, you start to see the world through that prism. You'll look at things and go, oh, that would be a tweet. You know, I should take a photo of this for Instagram. And it blocks you from being present and from interacting with the world in a way that's not. I'm not saying there's no positive use for these things. Of course there is. And there's lots of good things about them. But I find for myself, it harms my attention, not just in the moments in which I'm using it, but actually in a funny way, even more when I'm not, but I know I'm going to be back on it soon, you know, like in a few hours or, you know. So that's why for me, I need these really long breaks. And it really, really helps me. And the scientific evidence is pretty clear that it helps almost everyone.
So that's what I mostly like about this, like the book, that you write very specifically. It's not a self-help book, but it's definitely filled with very useful tips that myself, my family can implement immediately. So thanks again, Johann, for taking the time to do this important work.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm hopefully coming back to Norway later this year. And let's have a drink. Hooray.
I would love that. And we will lock up our phones somewhere so no one can be listening in on that conversation.
We'll burn them.
Thank
on
you
a
so
bonfire.
much, Johann.
Thank you.